Leonardo used his prestige to persuade the authorities to let him have the bodies. He probably told them he needed them for his painting, as there was no concept of using dissection to study how the body works. Until then, a healthy body was believed to be one that contained the correct balance between blood, bile and phlegm, along with the right amount of hot, cold, wet and dry. But Leonardo's radical approach was to study each organ separately, so he became the first person to work out how nerves originate in the spinal cord and wrote the perfect description of how they work. He discovered the existence of the appendix and worked out the role of the sphincter, which he referred to as the gatekeeper. Which it is really, isn't it? It's like one of them blokes you get at the front of a queue at a fairground ride going, hang on. Right, come on, let's have 4 of you. Not you! Wait! He was the first person to identify the heart as a muscle. He discovered it had 4 chambers, and hundreds of years before anybody made further advances, worked out what makes the heart deteriorate with old age. After analysing the body of a recently deceased old man, he said the arteries become closed as a result of
an overabundance of nourishment from the blood,
which we know as cholesterol. So, he was the first vegetarian, the first person to be aware of cholesterol, the first health food fanatic, really, if you ignore keeping half-dissected corpses around the house and planning to jump off a cliff strapped to a pair of wings made out of string.
But the organ he wrote about with possibly the greatest clarity was the penis.
It confers with intelligence and sometimes has intelligence of itself. Sometimes, although the will of the man desires to stimulate it, it remains obstinate, and sometimes it moves by itself without license from the man. Whether he be sleeping or waking, it does what it desires. Man is in the wrong in being ashamed to exhibit it. He should display with ceremony the one he serves.
After 6 years in Milan, Leonardo returned to Rome, where a Medici, Leo X, had been elected Pope. While there, he developed an intense dislike of Michelangelo, who was painting his ceiling. Michelangelo was not only his main artistic rival, he was deeply religious, which Leonardo distrusted, and he'd been to art school, which Leonardo resented. Once, in public, Leonardo was asked a scientific question and answered,
"Michelangelo will solve it for you."
To which Michelangelo replied,
"Explain it yourself. You, the man who made a model of a horse you could never finish."
I wonder if all the other artists stood under the ceiling going, "Fight, fight, fight, fight!"
I'm going to fall off the ceiling.
Oh, be off with you. Go on,
The new Pope became Leonardo's latest patron and put him up in the Vatican. So now, with the Pope paying him to paint, surely this time Leonardo would stick with his work and get it finished. But according to Vasari, he was assigned a picture to paint, but 7 months later, when the Pope asked if he could see how far Leonardo had got, Leonardo said excitedly that instead of painting, he'd been designing a new type of varnish out of herbs. Even then, he seems to have been given another chance. But around then, he received several offers of work from the King of France. Eventually, he accepted the King's offer, and he spent his last years there until he died in 1519, aged 67. And in one sense, Michelangelo was right. Leonardo never did finish that horse. Like so much of his work, his brilliant plans only came to fruition hundreds of years later, and this was finally built in honour of his original design in the 1990s. We can't all be Leonardos, but almost everybody does have talents. You might know someone for 20 years as a dustman or a receptionist, and then it turns out that for all that time they've been building locomotives out of matchsticks. In modern Britain, education, art and science are seen in the opposite way to how Leonardo saw them, considered important because they generate impressive turnover or because they're a vital strand of our export market. New Labour's attitude to the Mona Lisa would be, it's a marvellous example of how a small business can grow to become a leading exporter of smiles throughout Europe. And however sloppy Leonardo may have been about finishing things, at least he finished the Mona Lisa. Except that he didn't. The painting was originally called La Gioconda, but Leonardo never got round to handing it over to Mr. Gioconda, who'd commissioned it. Instead, he kept it himself until the day that he died, insisting there was still a bit more on it to do. And there is something quite magical about the fact that even for such a famous work of art, we can never be entirely certain what it was supposed to look like once it was finished.
Van Gogh did some eyeball pleasers. He must up in a pencil squeezer. He didn't do the Mona Lisa.
Donald Trump's on firing form next, The Apprentice USA, here on BBC Two in a moment.
If you're supposed to be sculpting a massive bronze horse for someone but can't seem to get started, why not log on to the Mark Steele Lectures website instead? Find it at open2.net.
Bastards.